Why did an 83-year-old Japanese carpenter take one look at my work and tell me my problem was not my hands, not my tools, but the pencil in my pocket? Because he was right, and it took me 20 years and one afternoon with him to see it. I have run a garage shop for more than 25 years. I could build a box, hang a door, cut a rabbit, and I still could not figure out why my joints came together with gaps I had to fill, why my drawers fit like they were mad at me, why everything I made looked a little off no matter how careful I was. I blamed my saw. I blamed my chisels. I bought better ones. Nothing changed. Then I spent an afternoon in the shop of an old man who had been cutting joinery since before I was born, and he fixed the whole thing with one idea that costs nothing. Stay with me, because the thing he showed me at the very end, a way to test your own accuracy on a scrap in about a minute, is the part I still do before every project. And there is one tool on his bench that he reached for 100 times that afternoon, and I had reached for maybe twice in my life. Let me tell you how it started, because the setup matters. A buddy of mine knew this old carpenter through a woodworking club, a man who had trained in Japan as a young man and spent his life building temple joinery and cabinets. Somewhere in his 80s, hands like tree roots, still sharp as a tack, I brought a small box I had built, walnut, dovetailed corners, the kind of thing I was proud of. I set it on his bench, expecting him to be impressed. He picked it up, turned it over once, ran a thumbnail along one of the joints, and set it back down. Then he asked to see how I laid out a cut. I pulled a pencil from my apron and a tape measure, hooked the tape, made a mark, and squared a line across the board with my pencil. Nothing I had done 10,000 times before. He watched, and he shook his head. Not unkindly, he just said, "That is why. Your box fights you because you are building to a smudge." Here is the thing he made me see, and it is the whole lesson, so I am going to slow down. A pencil line has width. A carpenter's pencil lays down a line that can be a 32nd of an inch wide, about the thickness of a stacked pair of playing cards. A regular pencil is finer, but it still has real width, and it still sits on top of the wood. When you go to cut or pare to that line, you have a decision to make every single time. Do you cut on the near side of the line, the far side, or split it? And you make that decision a little differently on every cut, without even knowing you are doing it. Across a whole project, those little differences stack up into gaps and joints that do not close. Then he showed me what he used instead. A marking knife. Just a thin blade ground on one side, sharp as a razor, and a marking gauge, which is a little tool that drags a pin or a small blade along the wood a set distance from the edge. He laid his square down and drew the knife along it. And instead of a line sitting on top of the wood, he had cut a tiny groove into the surface, maybe 1/100th of an inch deep, about the depth of a light fingernail scratch, but with one clean vertical wall. He said, "Now feel this." I ran my finger across it, and I could feel the wall. There was a physical trench in the wood, and one side of it was a clean vertical face. That wall is the whole game. When you put a chisel into a knife line, the flat back of the blade drops into that trench and registers against the wall, and it stops exactly there. It cannot wander. You are not aiming for a pencil mark anymore. You are dropping your tool into a track that is already cut. The line is not a suggestion of where to cut. The line is the first cut. He showed me how to actually use it, because there is a right way that took me a while to get. You hold the flat back of the knife tight against your square, bevel facing the waist side, and you drag it toward you in 2 passes. A light scoring pass first to set the line, then a firmer pass to deepen the wall. Press too hard on the first pass, and the knife follows the grain instead of your square, and your line wanders off into the wood. Light, then firm. A decent marking knife runs about $15, something like a hawk or a blue spruce, or you can grind one out of an old file. The marking gauge he used was a wheel gauge, a little brass tool with a round cutter on the end, maybe $30, and it slices a clean line parallel to an edge for your tenon cheeks and your dado walls, without you having to hold a square at all. I had spent years buying nicer chisels, and I had never owned a single decent marking knife. I had the whole thing backwards. I was upgrading the tools that follow the line and ignoring the one tool that makes the line. And let me put a number on what building to a smudge had cost me over the years, because it adds up quiet. A tube of wood filler every couple of projects to hide the gaps in my joints. Call it $8, a few times a year, for 20 years. That is not the real cost. The real cost is that a filled joint is a weak joint, and a filled joint looks like a filled joint forever, and I threw out or gave away a pile of pieces I was quietly ashamed of, walnut and cherry and maple, good wood, because the joints never closed. All of it traced back to a line I could not cut to, because it was sitting on top of the wood instead of cut into it. Sit with that for a second, because it reorganizes everything. For 20 years I thought marking was the step before the work. He taught me that marking is the work. The cut just follows the line the knife already made. Now I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought it too. A knife line only works where a chisel or a saw is going to register into it, and you cannot see a knife line as easily as a pencil line across a big rough board. Both true. He was not throwing the pencil in the trash. For rough layout, for marking a board to length before you break it down, for anything where you are not cutting a precision joint, a pencil is fine, and he used one too. The knife comes out when the cut has to be exact. Your dovetails, your tenon shoulders, your dado walls. The places where a 32nd of an inch of slop is the difference between a joint that closes and one that does not. He drew that line for me, and I have held it ever since. That was the first hour, and it would have been worth the whole trip. But then he showed me why the knife line only works if two other things are true, and this is where it went from a tip to a system. The first thing. A knife line is only as good as the edge that cuts it, and the edge that cuts your joint. He handed me one of his chisels and told me to shave a curl off the end grain of a piece of pine. End grain, the face where you cut across the fibers instead of along them, is the hardest surface to cut clean, and it shows a dull edge instantly. I pushed his chisel, and it peeled a shaving off end grain like it was cheese. Then he handed me mine, out of my own apron, and it crushed and skated and tore. Same wood, same hands. His edge did the work. Mine fought me. He said something I have never forgotten. He said, "You are not bad at this. Your tools are dull, and you have been calling that being bad. A sharp edge does the work. A dull edge makes you force it. And the second you force a cut, you have lost the line. You push harder. The tool skates. It dives past the wall, and the joint you laid out so carefully is gone. Every slip I had ever blamed on my clumsy hands was a dull edge making me push. And I will be straight with you, I cannot give you the full metallurgy of why his laminated Japanese chisel took an edge mine never would. He had a hard steel edge forge welded to a soft iron body, and it holds a keener edge and hones back faster than a single piece of tool steel. A metal worker could explain the crystal structure. I just know I felt the difference in a single shaving. He sharpened on waterstones, a coarse and a fine, and he flattened the back of the blade first, which is the step almost everybody skips. The back is half the cutting edge. If it is not dead flat and polished, the edge is not sharp no matter what you do to the bevel. Flatten the back once, really flatten it, and half your sharpening problems are gone for the life of the tool. He walked me through the rest of it too, and it was simpler than the internet had made me believe. A coarse waterstone around 1000 grit to set the edge, a fine one around 6000 to polish it, and a strip of leather with a little polishing compound to finish, which is called stropping. A combination waterstone, 1000 on one side and 6000 on the other, is about $40. He held the bevel freehand because he had done it 50,000 times, but he told me flat out that for a beginner, a cheap honing guide, one of those little Eclipse-style rollers for about $15, holds the angle steadier than a shaky hand, and there is no shame in it. He set his chisel bevel somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees, and he said for paring soft wood you can drop it lower and it slices easier, but 25 to 30 holds up for general work. The one thing he would not let me skip was flattening the stone itself, because a hollowed stone sharpens a curved edge, and a curved edge is a dull edge pretending to be sharp. If you have seen my sharpening video, this is the same idea, just handed to me by the man who made me finally believe it. A sharp edge does the work. I had heard those words 100 times online, and they never landed until an 83-year-old man peeled a shaving-off end grain with my own dull chisel after making it sharp in about 4 minutes on a stone. A number stuck with me. He said a properly sharpened edge should shave the hair off your arm, and if it will not do that, it is not sharp enough to cut a clean joint. That is the test. Not looking at it, not thumbing it, shaving with it. I went home and none of my chisels would do it. Not one. 20 years of woodworking and I had never once had a truly sharp tool in my hand, and I had been blaming myself the whole time. He showed me one more thing about a keen edge that I flat out did not believe until I watched it. He set a finely tuned hand plane on a board and peeled off a shaving so thin I could read newsprint through it. A couple thousandths of an inch, thinner than a human hair. That shaving is not a party trick. It is proof the edge is truly sharp, and the tool is set right. And an edge that can do that is an edge that drops into a knife line and follows it instead of fighting you. I sold my belt sander last year. Not because it is a bad tool, but because every time I reached for it, I was really reaching for a way to avoid admitting the joint was wrong. A tool whose main job was hiding my mistakes had not earned its corner of the bench. The second thing that makes a knife line work is the one I resisted the hardest, because it sounded like a waste of time. Reference faces. He took a rough board and, before he did anything else, he picked one face and one edge, made them flat and square to each other, and marked them with a little pencil squiggle he called a face mark. From then on, every measurement, every knife line, every gauge setting came off those two reference surfaces and only those. Never the other side, never a different edge. He showed me the marks the old shops used, because they matter. On the good face you draw a little curly mark, a face mark, and on the good edge you draw a caret, or a little check, that points back toward that face mark. Now, no matter how you turn the board or how many days pass, you can glance at any part and instantly know which two surfaces are your references. Every joint on that piece gets measured and knifed off the face mark and the edge mark, so they all share one origin. He checked flatness with two straight sticks laid across the board at each end, called winding sticks, and he sighted across their top edges. If the two sticks looked parallel, the board was flat. If one end tipped, the board was in wind, which is the old word for twisted, and he knew to plane the high corners down before he trusted that face. Two sticks and your eye, no fancy tool. I asked him why it mattered if the board was already pretty flat. He set a square against the face I had not referenced and showed me daylight under it, a gap of maybe a 64th of an inch at the far end, the thickness of 2 sheets of paper, on a board I would have sworn was dead flat. A board is never perfectly square all the way around, he said. If you measure this joint off the good face and that joint off the bad edge, the two joints do not share the same starting point, and they will never line up, and you will spend the rest of the build wondering why. Every part of a piece has to be built from the same two surfaces, or the errors do not cancel, they add. That is why my drawers fit like they were mad at me. I was measuring off whatever edge was closest, and every part started from a slightly different place. Put a number on that. If 8 parts of a cabinet each start a mere 64th of an inch off, each from a different surface, by the last joint you can be an 1/8 of an inch out. The thickness of 2 stacked coins, and no careful cutting on earth closes that gap. The error was baked in at the tape, not the saw. And this is where I part ways with a lot of the woodworking world. Everybody online is chasing the next tool, the track saw, the domino joiner, the $400 dovetail jig. That old man built temple joinery with a handful of chisels, a saw, a marking knife, and 2 sticks he used to check for twist. The gear was never the thing. The order of operations was the thing, and no tool you can buy fixes an order of operations that starts in the wrong place. Think about what that means for a second. It was never my skill. It was that I had no fixed point to build from. A guy measuring every part of a cabinet off the same 2 reference surfaces will beat a far more talented guy who measures off whatever is handy, every single time. The talent gap disappears when the starting point stops moving. He walked me through how those 3 things lock together, and this is the part I want you to carry out of here. You flatten a reference face and edge. You lay out every joint with a knife off those references, so every line is a real cut in a known place. And you keep your edge sharp enough to drop into that knife line and follow it without forcing. Reference, layout, edge. That is the whole system, and every single thing I had been doing wrong lived inside one of those 3. My tools were not the problem. My understanding of the order of operations was the problem. I had been trying to cut my way to accuracy that was supposed to be built in before the saw ever touched the wood. You know the feeling I am talking about. You cut a joint, it does not quite close, so you shave a little off, and now it is loose on one side and tight on the other. So you shave the other side, and 20 minutes later you have a joint that is smaller than you started, still crooked, and a little pile of chisel pairings and swear words on the bench. That was my whole woodworking life, and I thought it was normal. It is not normal. It is what building without references and without a knife line feels like, and it goes away the day you fix the front end. My wife walked into the shop once while I was in the middle of one of those spirals, and asked if the wood had insulted me personally. It kind of felt like it had. Let me tell you where this does not save you, because he was honest about that too, and I will be. This is for solid wood joinery where a knife line and a chisel meet. On a big sheet of plywood you are breaking down with a circular saw. A knife line is pointless. Mark it with a pencil or a knife and cut to a straight edge. The saw is not registering into anything. And on green or wet wood, none of this precision holds, because the wood keeps moving after you cut it. If your board reads much above 12% on a moisture meter, and a general tools meter runs about $30, let it sit in your shop and settle before you build. Or your perfect knife line joint opens up by winter anyway. He built in a climate near the coast, humid most of the year. I build in a heated shop that goes bone dry every northern winter. Same joint, 2 different moisture worlds, and the wood does not care how clean your line was if it was wet when you cut it. I learned that the hard way. On a wide slab of air-dried oak I never checked. I cut beautiful knife line joinery into it, proud as could be, and by February in my dry shop the panel had shrunk enough that every one of those perfect joints had opened a hairline gap. The layout was flawless. The wood was still wet. A perfect line on wet wood is a perfect joint that fails right on schedule. I want to go back to that chisel, the one he reached for 100 times, because when I got home and really watched myself work, I realized how rarely I picked up a chisel, and how much I leaned on machines and sandpaper to fix cuts that were never laid out right in the first place. He barely sanded anything. He said sandpaper is for the finish, not for fixing a joint. If you are sanding a joint to make it fit, the joint was wrong before you started, and you cannot sand your way out of a bad line. That one stung, because I had a belt sander I used to bully a lot of bad joinery into submission. Which brings me to the thing he showed me at the very end, the accuracy test I promised you, and I still do it before I start anything that matters. He handed me a square scrap, and told me to lay out a simple line all the way around it with my knife and square, going around all 4 faces, meeting back where I started. Then he said, "Look at where your last line meets your first. If the knife comes back to the exact same point, your square is true, your technique is square, and you are ready to cut joints. If it misses, if there is a little step where the line does not meet itself, that gap is every error in your square and your marking, stacked up and made visible on one piece of scrap in about a minute. Mine missed by a hair. A small step where the line came back not quite to itself, maybe a 64th of an inch, about the thickness of a sheet of cardstock. He said, "That is small, but that is the gap in every joint you have ever cut, and now you can see it. Check your square against a known straight edge." And sure enough, my combination square, a cheap one I had trusted for years, was out, not by much, by exactly that hair. A guy at my club later checked his the same way, and found his fancy square was dead on, but his technique was rocking the square as he marked, which threw it the same amount. 1 minute, 1 scrap, and it tells you whether the problem is your tool or your hands. I have never started a real project without doing it since. That old carpenter passed a couple of years after that afternoon. I only spent the 1 day with him, and it rearranged everything I thought I knew about why my work was not good enough. It was never talent. It was building to a smudge instead of a wall, measuring off a moving starting point, and forcing dull tools through cuts that a sharp edge would have done for me. None of it costs money. A marking knife is a few dollars. Flattening a chisel back is free. Picking a reference face is free. Pick one, the knife, and use it on your next real joint instead of a pencil, and watch it close up tighter than anything you have built. Next time I want to actually cut a dovetail this way, start to finish, off a knife line, so you can see the joint fall together instead of getting forced together. Go sharpen something and go make some sawdust.